I'd like to say how pleased I am to be here, and thank Margaret, thank you for inviting me, and thank Anne and Roz for organising the special issue. I've been very interested to read the other contributions and to listen to the other presentations. And I was particularly interested in the presentation by Alan Brannen, who unfortunately can't be here today, because I draw on his work quite heavily in my article. Now, Alan comments in his piece on the fact that the editors had allowed him a special license to write in a personal mood. And this made me realise that, in fact, my article was probably not personal enough. So I therefore wanted to use this opportunity to personalise my contribution. Sorry, Julia. I don't think I'll make it embarrassing. And the more so, because when reading about Julia's trajectory, I became aware of both the similarities and differences in our own experiences and narratives. So that's what I want to address. So between the 1940s and the 1960s, the starting similarity is that we belong to the same birth cohort. And we've had quite similar life course events. So we both married in the year in which we graduated. I had my first child. I know it's a year later, but it's the same birth cohort, right? Then we both had our first child, it's my only child, in fact, before the age of 25. But in most other respects, I think our paths were parallel and have perhaps already diverged by that stage. So Julia studied sociology. I studied languages and literature, and I read French and German in language and literature in London. And the only experience I had actually of this building, because I was in a ladies' college in Hampstead, which meant that, and we actually had all our lectures in the college. So I never had to put a foot in the Senate House until I had my French oral. And that was a very unpleasant experience, so my memories of Senate House are not that great. And then I went on to study social policy and administration at the LSE, whereas Julia's subsequent studies were all on sociology. But in fact, I then went off to Australia, where I studied, well, I did my PhD on stylistics and statistics, as Julia was still concentrating on sociology when she did her PhD. But I did my PhD in the 1960s and came back to the UK then in early 1970s. I had enormous difficulty in getting my first academic post. But then I managed to pursue an uninterrupted career, not always a very coherent one, I have to say, at least in disciplinary terms, where I sought to combine my various interests in languages, cultures, and socio-economic and political institutions. And Julie was working on sociology of the family, and family structures and policies figured quite large in my work. So that's in fact how we came to meet. So the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, if we fast forward, and if my recall is correct, and Julia might be able to correct me on some of these, I think I met Julia in the late 1980s when we were both working on resources in households and the family employment relationship. And together with Margaret Brannen and Steen Mangen, who is not with us, we'd established the Cross-National Research Group in 1985, which for 30 years organised seminars on cross-national research methods and published 7 series in cross-national research papers. Julia, again, if my memory is correct, it was through Margaret that I met Julia, because they were both involved in this East-West network of researchers in 1998-1990 under the auspices of the European Coordination Centre for Research and Documentation in the Social Sciences, otherwise known as the Vienna Centre, which had organised a seminar in Finland where Margaret and I met in 1984. In 1989, Julia, Margaret, Gail, Wilson, who's already been mentioned, and I brought together the cross-national research group and the resources in households study group to organise a seminar on cross-national studies of resources in households. And then in the joint introduction to the papers that we presented at the end, Julia and I were both co-authors. It was Cross-National Papers 1.5. We showed how a greater understanding of the material presented in each of the papers could be gained by examining the different approaches used by authors and their international partners, and by recognising their incompatibilities for comparative purposes, both in the projects they were describing and by reading across the contributions. So we were working together on methods and in an international, cross-national context. And Julia then also contributed to the second seminar in the fourth series on concepts and contexts in international comparisons of family policies in Europe in 1994, with a piece on sociological definitions of the employment-family relationship in the United Kingdom. And in her contribution, she reviewed the available qualitative and quantitative data, including the TCRU daycare study, which Peter Moss had published in 1991. And then both Julia and Peter invited me to present cross-national research methods seminars to staff at the TCRU in 1998 and 2000, which you may or may not recall. Right, so the other crossing of paths, meeting of paths with Julia were through mixed methods training, and mixed methods training specifically in international contexts. So between 2003 and 2005, this is where I think we really consolidated our links, and I think we can safely say that our thinking met in that area, certainly in the cross-national research methods and mixing methods. So in 2003, DG Research and DG Employment in the European Commission were striving to showcase the relevance of the relevance of research to policy, and particularly in the area of socioeconomic research that was funded under the framework programs. And DG Research reluctantly agreed to fund a couple of research methods workshops for a cluster of teams with projects on family and welfare topics. And this is where Claire and I got together, and Peter was also involved in that. And they had a study on childcare, which is one of the projects in the cluster. And I was asked to provide, to bring together the various projects and get them to talk about the importance of the research they were doing for policy. Now, at that time, the linkages between research and policy were not often being made. And as you might imagine, all the projects in their very early stages did not make a reference to what impact they were going to have on policy. And so I said, well, no, we can't at this stage say very much. So could we instead do something which will be of use to everybody, which is have some workshops on methods? The Commission agreed, very reluctantly, to let us organise a couple of workshops. We really wanted to organise 3. We wanted to have one on qualitative methods, one on quantitative methods, and one on joint methods and policy. They only let us organise the qualitative and the quantitative ones, and Claire convened the qualitative methods workshop in 2003, and then a separate one on quantitative methods was held shortly afterwards, but with a completely different set of people, illustrating that the two domains were not going to meet. In that context. However, I was asked to write up a policy review on the family and welfare cluster, and what I managed to do was to repeat the exercise of comparing the findings from projects on similar topics, but using different methods. So I tried to bring together, but at the output end, how the projects could combine together to produce useful findings for policy, which is quite, and that, I've referred to that work in the article in the special issue. And then in 2006, Julia convenes an ESRC NCRM funded training seminar on cross-national comparative research called Challenge, Cooperation and Compromise, which was held at the Institute, and that's where I met Anne, if my memory serves me correctly, Anne. And that led on then to, in 2007, a postgraduate training workshop with Julia and Alan, which Anne organised in Bergen. And Alan at that time was a colleague of mine at Loughborough as well, so you can see we all link up in one way or another. And the title of the workshop was Analysing Comparative Research, Qualitative and Mixed Methods, which was absolutely spot on. And my contribution was called Doing Effective Cross-National Comparative Policy Research, Combining Approaches, so a slightly different take. So that was that one. And then the second stage in this training, 2009 to 2012-13. So building on the experience that we'd gained from running the cross-national research seminars and various NCR training events, in 2009, Julia and I prepared a proposal for an ESRC Researcher Development Initiative on international social research training under the auspices of the Social Research Association and the LSE Centre for International Studies, where I was visiting fellow at that time. The proposal was accepted, and it just hit all the buttons, didn't it? That everything that they were wanting, we could provide. So Julia and I worked as consultants on the programme between 2011 and 2013, and mixed methods was very important in these workshops. And the programme we produced a framework for international social research methods case studies. So framing, I come back to the framing idea. And Julia was very, very helpful on formulating the sorts of questions that we wanted the researchers to address when they were writing up their methods. And this ran through all the workshops and in the papers that were subsequently published. The NCRM have, I don't know whether you're aware of it, a database called Restore. And we wrote up and got other people to write up case studies using the framework. So it's the sort of data bank now, because we've got 8 case studies. Claire did one. What's that side of her? Sue worked. Well, Julia wrote up the project that she'd done with Sue. I did one, and various other people whom we'd worked with or knew. And Julia and I reviewed them and accepted them, and they're all up and available. But the way that we've done it, you can actually read across the case studies. So we ask, at the beginning we've got key words or key research terms. So the spread of disciplines and the different sorts of methods that people have used, and different stages in the design and production and dissemination of the projects. And so that's been very helpful, particularly to postgraduates, for example, because it sets out, how you write your methods chapter, basically. And you can read across. There's one section which is on ethical issues. So again, you can read across and see how people have dealt with the ethical issues. Sage were very interested in what we'd done, and I don't know whether you're aware that Sage now has its own methods data bank, which brings to, I think they were targeting 500 research or case studies of different research methods. So they're both individual methods, or they can be the totality of a project. So how you conducted the project and all the stages through the project. And that is imminently online, if not already. And the case studies that we'd done for Restore, we sort of recycled them and adapted them to their framework. So they're all on there as well. So they were two quite good outputs. Following Alan's lead, because in his paper he does a sort of analysis of number of projects to see how many were mixed methods and so forth. We've only got 8 projects, and so our findings are not shattering or significant, but they're all mixed methods, and that's the starting point. What's also happened is there's one project with only one method, in the sense that they use qualitative approaches, but there are different sorts of methods within that. And there's one with 9 different methods. But what Julia was particularly emphasised when we were drawing up the framework, and then when we were inviting people to write up their projects, was the way in which they should demonstrate, having used different methods, how they were integrated in the analysis. And I think that that's been quite key to helping people to understand, you don't just go and use a series of methods and then what do you do with them, how do you bring the analysis together. So I think that's been quite an important contribution that we've been able to make. One of the projects had 21 different countries, but only used 3 different methods, which is quite interesting as well, because the issue of scale, if you've got a very large number of countries, it's probably more practical to use a smaller number of methods, and that's where the concentration is more often than not on quantitative methods. The one with only one method is education, and talking in the context of the Institute of Education, I have to be careful what I say, but my reading of education is that it is rather a number of disciplines and methods brought together. So perhaps that's something you might want to talk about subsequently. So anyway, that's the outcome, one of the outcomes of what we did. So now on to, I think, Julia's impact has been. Now, I didn't have the pleasure of being involved in the Mixed Methods Conference in 1989 that Alan talks about, and which led to the 1992 book, which I do refer to quite extensively in my paper. But in writing about mixed methods in international comparative research, or what I've called methodological pluralism, and in citing Julia's work in the book that I did with a chapter of which I've adapted for the article, I realised that her main contribution to my own work, in conjunction with Alan, has been to provide, and this is something that Anne mentioned earlier on, a theoretical framework. In other words, she's theorised what I've always, I think, been practising from an international perspective. When I did the postgraduate course in social policy administration, I was able to do a mini project, and I did a project on a demographic topic, and it was already a comparative project. And at the LSE, the course had a really wide spread of disciplines. We had some sociology, we had psychology, we had criminology, we had statistics, we had some of the big names. Titmus is obviously a leading figure, but it was a wide range of disciplines, and I have to say I tend to consider myself as a jack of all trades and a master of none. So I've usually been putting my place when I'm working with sociologists, and I have to say that working with Julia has been a very pleasant experience compared with some of the other experiences that I've had. So that LSE was the start of my doing this interdisciplinary comparative work, international work, multidisciplinary, I would say, rather than interdisciplinary. And leading on to, I did Franco-British projects in the 1970s and 80s, and then European projects in the 1990s, and then into after 2000. But I also have worked in institutions which have been technological universities, much of the time, Aston and then at Loughborough. And in technological universities, interestingly, the social sciences don't get much of a look in, except that in both institutions, over the course of time when I was there, we ended up having more students in social sciences than we did in other disciplines. But what I would say about Julia's impact on my work, since I studied French, my first degree, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Molière and Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an exercise here. I don't know how many of you will understand this, but il y a plus de 40 ans que je dis de la prose sans que j'en susse rien, et je vous suis le plus obligé du monde de m'avoir appris cela. Monsieur Jourdain, who is a bourgeois gentilhomme, and discovers that that you either speak in prose or you speak in verse, and not feeling confident in verse, he realizes that for 40 years, I've been speaking prose, and I didn't realize that I was doing it. I'm really under an obligation to you, very grateful to you for having taught me that. And I could say the same of Julia. I've been practicing mixed methods for 30 years and was not aware that there was actually a theory behind it all. So, just to finish off, what I became aware of working with cross disciplines with people from different disciplinary backgrounds was that these paradigm wars were still being waged, and I think they still are, both within and between countries and disciplines and types of research. And particularly working in a French context a lot of the time, I have been made very much aware that the French are not able to move outside disciplinary boundaries very easily, and I've always been a bit of an anathema to them. They don't know how to classify me. And I present myself as social policy, right? But social policy doesn't exist in France as a discipline. So anyway, just to finish off, what I think is very important in multi-methods approaches is to have a conducive environment, and I think we found those conducive environments. So applied policy relevant research, and we've done a series on evidence and policy, the international dimensions that Julia's been involved in as well. Social policy research, it's so much easier to bring it all together. Multidisciplinary research seminars, different research cultures coming together, and that's one of the things which I think I've learned most from, is working across cultures with people coming from different research traditions and cultures and understanding where they're coming from. And that's where the analysis of the context is just so vital. And then the methods training and capacity building. I think I could safely say that Julia and I have been on the same wavelengths, and we've not worked in the same institutions together, but we've always been able to find that we've got meeting points across the methods and the international context. And I think that I was really pleased to see when the journal was created and to be invited, as I say, to contribute to this issue of it. So thank you very much.